Good morning, good day, good afternoon to anyone who's listening to this. So my name is Ulf Andreasson. I work as a senior solutions engineer here in EMEA for Sumo Logic. And today I'm going to take you through a end-to-end observability demo, or effectively imagine that you are a on-call engineer, and we're going to take you through a couple of steps of what you would be doing when you get an alert on a service level objective, and effectively exploring the sort of the metrics and trying to diagnose the problem, trying to understand what really happens within your application space. So for that, we're going to use a Sumo Logic unified platform. And this platform is able to really kind of ingest and take care of and analyze any kind of application infrastructure telemetry. So we have ways and means to bring in metrics, metadata, logs, and traces into this platform. And it's a SaaS service. So from your perspective, you don't really need to do anything to kind of manage and make sure that the data is there, preparing the data for analytics and stuff like that. All of that is effectively done by Sumo. And the beauty of kind of centralizing all the information in one place is that you can pivot around the different kind of data sources. So depending on what you want to look at, if you're just monitoring things, or if you're trying to diagnose or troubleshoot things, so you have all the data in hand for kind of doing that. And that's really what we're trying to give all our customers here. Now, from a DevSecOps perspective, you're going to be required to use different data sources depending on what you're trying to do. So if you're just monitoring things, like in this case, I'm an on-call engineer, I really want to be able to understand what goes on within my environment. But the more you need to sort of start to diagnose and troubleshoot, the more you need sort of deep down or detailed data sources for that. So it's very much a question of what kind of role you have within the company and what sort of data sources you need to support that role. But as I said, we in Sumo, we can help you do that. So we have a lot of customers who are effectively sort of monitoring things, looking at metrics, trying to understand what goes on. But then you can pivot into traces and logs to really understand what did go wrong when something obscure happens. So that's really what we're trying to kind of take you through today. So in this demo, and it's a fairly short demo, but there's a lot of things we're going to go through. So I'm going to try to kind of take it step by step. And of course, you can always kind of send some questions in the chat and all that, but I'll try to take all those questions in the end of the demo. But in this demo, what we're doing here, so we have a banking application, and think of it like the company is a sort of banking. It's a bank, and it has an application that runs in Kubernetes, written in Java, runs on top of AWS infrastructure. And it has sort of a typical sort of DevOps type application. It's got a load balance in front of it. There's a payment service that's being deployed on a Kubernetes cluster, running in various pods in that deployment, and that communicates an accounting service that's backed by an RDS database. And RDS in this case is effectively an old MySQL database. So it's a mission critical application, and it runs in all the banking locations. So I really want to be able to kind of pinpoint and identify any kind of issues I'm getting when I'm getting them. And of course, there's various ways to do that. But one of the things is that we have a lot of dashboards and a lot of means to kind of handle that. But what you probably would do is that you would have some kind of messaging system. So in this case here, I'm using Slack, and I'm getting sort of notifications in a Slack channel, and I got multiple Slack channels here because I got multiple applications and multiple infrastructures I'm looking at. But in this case here, what I'm seeing is that I'm having a payment service SLO that goes beyond sort of 5%. And it's just a simple webhook that giving me some sort of payload in there, and it actually gives me the query that was identifying this, but it also gives me time range and a potential link to the playbook that I would be using for trying to resolve this. As you can see as well, is that previous to this, it was another similar sort of problem, but another one, and that was resolved. So once I'm resolving this, I'm also going to get an announcement in the Slack channel kind of saying that that's resolved. But in either case, let's jump into this. So we'll go into the link that I was given in this Slack message. And it takes me straight into dashboard. And this dashboard is effectively a way for me to see my payment service and the kind of SLOs for those. So here I actually have the outlier that kind of showed me that something wrong is going on. And I can also see that the error rate has increased. I see what type of infrastructure is actually kind of behind those error rates. But one thing that I'm very kind of concerned about is, of course, my own customers. So this is a banking service, and obviously, my customers are being affected by this, and I can then immediately see which of my customers are being affected. And I can even see some of the queries behind that, so the signatures around that. But this kind of helps me to identify who's actually impacted. I can then contact my support team, and they can reach out to those customers to make sure that we can handle those, and we can sort of talk to those and make sure that their impact is not too bad, so to speak. So that's good, because that means that I can handle my customers. Now, the other thing that I can see is effectively how is my company being impacted by this. So obviously the transaction volume has gone down dramatically, so that's good to know, and that's also kind of something that I maybe have to, speak to people internally about. But this just gives me an understanding of not just who my customers are that's being impacted, but also how we as a company are being impacted. So that's kind of the business aspects of it. Now, let's look at the kind of infrastructure components. And what I have here is effectively error rate by pod. So I'm looking at the error rates, and it seems like they're evenly distributed throughout all the pods. So this is not just one single pod or one single container failing. This seems to be more of a kind of generic problem here, right? So all my pods here, or many of my pods here, are showing red. And, I guess it all depends on, when I look at it, it depends on which they are and so on. But what I can do here, and I can also see that from a memory and CPU perspective, memory seems to be fairly high, and you can see the spark line here as well. So it's kind of, we're trying to give you as much information as possible here in a very short manner. But I can click on one of these pods, and basically it will kind of give me this this kind of view on the right-hand side, right? And I can pivot into logs and all those kind of things. But what I want to do here is that, because this seems to be more on a deployment level, so I want to try to understand this from a deployment perspective. And here's effectively all my infrastructure. So it's the containers, the pods, the deployment, and the service, and all the way up to a cluster, right? What I'm interested in here is trying to understand how this kind of all comes together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my entity dashboard. And this is going to show me my Kubernetes cluster, but we focused in on the deployment, which is regarding this payment service. So you can see I actually have two clusters here. I have another coffee bar demo as well. But, we focused on trying to understand what happens with the payment service. So that's what we're going to do. Now, when I look at this, the pods, there's a number of pods, as in this case, 40 pods running. None of them seem to be failing, or there isn't really much of an issue from that perspective. but I do have a lot of connection problems. And it's, most of the pods are running, so I don't see a problem with that. But I do see these connection problems, and I see that the payment service seems to be making up a lot of those. And the connection service is also in relation to the accounting service. So obviously something's happening. If you remember the layout of the application, it's a payment service that effectively runs on a Kubernetes cluster communicating to accounting service. So something seems to be wrong here. When we look at the rest of the kind of information we have around this deployment, it seems to be fairly okay. Nothing screams out, nothing majorly bad or anything like that. So let's dig into the kind of connections here between the payment and the account. And what I want to do here is that I want to look at the deployment, but in this case, because we have connection problems, and this is a microservices architecture, so what I want to kind of try to investigate is really the traces, the communication between the different services. So here we're sort of pivoting into traces, and we can now see all the connections between all these services. And it's the beauty with Sumo as well is that it has all this in context. So I get the same timeline for when I was getting the alert. Having all the information about that. We're looking at the banking cluster, we're looking at the namespace that is the mobile banking app, and we're looking at the deployment that has to do with accounting and the kind of payment services. Now, what I can do here to kind of further enhance this is that I can say that I only want to look at traces that has an error rate more than 0. So there's no reason for me to kind of look at anything that's successful and seems to be fine. So in this case, we're looking at traces that I can identify some errors within. And, the duration here is fairly high on many of these. So here we get 30 seconds, 1 minute, and so on. So let's kind of take one of these here. I can see there's a number of spans in this trace, and I can also see that there's a fairly high number of error rates in this. So opening up this span, and I can toggle this arrow spans only, but effectively all of these spans shows an error. And so this is just going to show me all the spans and how I can, what I can do with that. But basically, and I can sort of increase and decrease this size and all that, but right. What I obviously there's something here with the accounting service trying to get an ID from effectively the database, and it seems to be failing. So, I can see that it's, I can see the more details here again. It's a CRUD repository defined by ID that seems to be failing. And, I have a lot of metadata here. So I got the metadata for the Kubernetes cluster. I got the metadata from Sumo. I got sort of information about the span, and I can see, pivoting into the infrastructure here. What I want to do is that I want to pivot into this, and I want to look at the raw logs. So we've gone from kind of identifying that we have an issue. We've seen through the traces that, here's an example of that. And now I want to pivot in from this trace in to see what kind of error message am I seeing from this. This kind of, again, all in context here with regards to, my information that I'm looking at, the time frame and everything that I'm looking at. And here I see, I got about 3,000 lines here of log messages. So obviously this is kind of tricky to really understand all of it. But I can see that there's a lot of error messages. Now, one thing that Sumo has that we uniquely uses as well is something called log reduce. So I click on this button here, and that's going to take me, what's going to happen now is that I'm going to take each and every log line of these 3,454 messages, And I'm going to sort of group them together. And we do this using machine learning. So the beauty here is that we take every single log line. This is not some kind of sampling. If you get 10 million log lines, you can still do this. You know, it comes back in maybe a minute or two. But it really is scalable and it works very well. What you get out of it is that you're going to get a signature of each and every log line. So effectively, think of it like you're grouping the log lines, not syntactically, but you're grouping them by the means of it. And what I can see here is that the most common log line is actually something had to do with the timestamp. Not surprised on that. But the second common log line here is effectively connection is not available. Request timed out or after 30 seconds there. And I got some SQL errors, and effectively here is also too many connections from my JDBC connection. So this obviously is a sort of kind of JDBC connection issue. And, you know, as an on-call engineer, sorry, as an on-call engineer, my first sort of interest here is that really, or my first priority here is really to restore the application. So the immediate action I would take is that I will reach out to the database team or to kind of the people who's in charge of that, and I would speak to them and I would basically ask them to kind of increase the number of connections, increase the memory allocation to the database so that we can get these connections running again. That's probably what would be the case here, right? Because obviously, right now we just have too many connection requests to this database, and that's kind of not succeeding. Now, once I've done that, I should see that the application comes back, the customers are being supported and provided with as they should, so that should be fine, right? Now, I still haven't, or what I still want to be able to do is really find the root cause of this. So I know that I got a lot of connections not being provided for. I know that I'm having an issue with those connections here. So what I would want to do here is that I would kind of go back into Sumo. And if you recall, we had the Explorer here, and I can just open up all of that. So I can see all of my information here. Now, in addition to the Explorer and being able to sort of investigate the area that I have, I also have something called the Root Cause Explorer. And the Root Cause Explorer is effectively a way for me to understand and to monitor my environment from any kind of anomaly. And we look at anomalies of like, you know, error, or the typical golden signals that's been discussed by Google, and that's kind of, you know, the golden signals as they mentioned it. And what I can see here is that over time, I have different kind of errors, and the deviation also kind of is different. So I got quite a lot of very high sort of deviated issues here with regards to network and with regards to kind of the load of the system. And down here, I got some error messages, and I can just click on any of these and I'll get more information out here, as you've seen before. But I can kind of see that. Now I can sort of drill down into more specifics of the last couple of minutes or whenever I want to look at this. And I can kind of see that I have a throughput issue here with regards to our RDS. And I can also see that I get read IOPS issue here that's drifting 566%. So let me show you that more clearly. 566% for the last 30 minutes. And I can even see the metrics here for this, right? So the green line here is effectively, or the two green lines, if you can see them, is effectively the deviation, it's the measurement, but it's time shifted with 1 day and 7 days. So normally I wouldn't kind of see this kind of, not spike, but whatever bridge I have here. But so this is definitely something happening. Now, what I could do as well, which I didn't do, is that I can sort of drill into this more. So I can focus on a specific namespace or maybe a specific AWS region or something like that. So I haven't done that here, but I can certainly do that if I get a very large environment. So there's a lot of capabilities there. But of course, again, so we can see we get this spike here. Something's happening with the load on the RDS database, which obviously is related to the issue I've been taking you through. But what I then want to be able to do is that I want to look at all, and just to kind of show you this as well, once I'm looking at this, I'm getting recommendations for various kind of dashboards or various kind of data sources I should be looking at. But in this case, I just want to go in and look at all the logs that I'm having from this kind of this instance of RDS in this case, and again, this kind of time frame here. What I can see here is that I have the slow query from MySQL. So within the Sumo package, when we look at RDS or MySQL, a couple of those kind of things that customers typically want to understand is that anytime you're starting to experience queries, as in SQL queries, that take a very long time. So this is kind of something that's alarming in a way, because once I start to see these popping up and effectively getting the result of those, that means that I'm having a lot of slow queries here in my system. Now, this is exactly what I'm having. And if you recall also from the previous kind of view here, I also had some throughput issues here that was kind of related to this. So obviously this is kind of concerning. And what I would kind of suspect here is that basically what's happening is that I'm having a throughput issue in the sense of like the connection pool is running out of space, and it's the slow queries. Sorry. The slow queries are eating up the CPU, and therefore the connection pool is running out, and it's taking longer and longer to process the connection, which really means that more and more CPU is being consumed by the slow queries. So this is obviously something that you really should be keeping in control of. And of course, you can run those kind of searches whenever you want to. But what we would do in Sumo is that we would go into the alerting, the unified monitoring, and in here, I already have sort of some folders here with some queries, and one of those queries here, and here you can actually see the other one. This is kind of the one that really notified me about the issues. But in this case, what I would want to do is I would want to set up a monitor that basically runs the slow query, and when it has a result of greater than 10 within 5 minutes, then I should be notified. And in this case, I'm going to get notified with just an email, but I got multiple different ways I can notify. We could be using Slack as we did before, or any other means there. But I mean, this would just show me that when I'm developing slow queries within the system and the infrastructure, I'm going to get a notification. I can then act on that, and that would probably, or hopefully, I would be able to proactively make sure that I'm not getting into this issue as I've been showing you here in this demo. So that's probably what you would do. So obviously you want to be notified if there's any kind of development or any kind of issue being developed within your infrastructure, but of course also then being able to sort of predictively run queries or searches or just setting alerts so that you can be notified of interesting things that you would want to see. And with that, I'm hoping that I've showed you quite a lot of capabilities here. And some of these things as well, as I said earlier in the beginning of this, that we really kind of bring in pretty much any kind of metric or any kind of telemetry into Sumo. But we just don't bring on, we don't only bring in the telemetry itself, we also bring in a lot of enrichment and metadata to that. So for example, you get the account information, you get the regions, the namespaces, the entities, because having all that with sort of AWS means that not only do we collect it very easily, but we can also bring in the context of what's happening, where it's happening, what type of application, what type of region, how does all those things stitch together. This means that once I'm actually querying the data, I can get a lot more context out of it, and I can be much more sort of sure on, knowing what's happening and where things are happening and how it can kind of go ahead. So just to recap, what you've seen in this demo is that basically I got alerted not via email in this case, but I actually took it through Slack channel. But it could be email, it could be PagerDuty, or any means that you would want to use. Now, from that alert, I was taking into relevant view, or as in dashboard in Sumo. And there I would see more context of it, not just from a technical perspective, but also from a business impact. So I could go and alert my customers being impacted. I can go and alert people within my own company, as in how this is being impacting us, and effectively then being able to explore how this stitches together, what kind of components within your environment is potentially the reason for this, and the impact of that as well. I then drilled deeper into this because I could see that there's a bit of a connection issue, and I was using traces because that's the best means of being able to identify those kind of issues. And from the traces, I could then pivot from that trace, and I can even pivot from a trace, from a span ID if I had that. I didn't do that in the demo here, but it's really all about the context of what you bring in, you can kind of do. And from there, I could really see that using logs and log reduce, I could really see that the kind of cause for this issue was really that the connection in RDS, the connection pool in RDS was running out of both memory as well as connections. Using Root Cause Explorer, I could identify that I had an issue with the load on RDS. I would then suspect root cause analytics is always a bit of kind of, you may not always be 100% correct. But in this case, I suspected that the slow queries are eating up the CPU and therefore limit me in the way of providing connections to the application, so to speak. So what I proactively did there is to set up an alert so that I would see when slow queries will start to develop in my system, so I wouldn't run into this again. So I'm hoping that this was kind of a useful demo, and there's of course any kind of alternative use cases, and just think of it like how you would be able to use this in your environment. But this is just one of the examples, and we have a lot of customers using this and being very happy with kind of having that information and having that information all in the same place. Being able to pivot from metrics into traces to logs and back, and whichever way you want to do, right? And also be able to kind of identify those kind of metrics that are deviating from the kind of normal, so that you actually get into identifying the kind of anomalies there in an effective way. So let me see, I did promise you to kind of make sure that any questions we have. So happy to take any questions you may have there. Just ping me in the Q&A session or questions there. So one question that is in there is that basically how is Sumo priced, or how do you pay for Sumo? So the simplest and easiest response to that is that Sumo is, our licensing is depending on the amount of ingest. So, and it is a tricky one because, I mean, you know, how much you're going to ingest, it's you probably know that best, but it sort of depends on, you know, logs is going to take more, spans or traces is also going to take a bit more, metrics is pretty much, you know, those doesn't really consume any space, but basically, the amount of ingest coming into Sumo, that's really what you're paying for. Now, the beauty with that is that any kind of searches or any kind of analytics you do, you know, the computational part of that is not paid for. The amount of users is not paid for. It's only the ingest that goes into Sumo. Any other question? Yes, there's one here. Retention time. So metrics is being stored for 1 year, and there's no sort of way, or exactly 13 months, but there's no sort of configurable way with regards to metrics. But with regards to logs, you're in complete control there. So effectively, what you will do is that you will bring sort of logs into Sumo, but then you can put them into different indexes. And depending on which index it is, you can also then say, like, this index is going to have 5 days retention. This other index is going to have 30 days retention. This third index is going to have effectively 10 years of retention. So you can in complete control of effectively how long retention you want to have for different data sources. So that's actually very good because, I mean, and I should probably say that as well, that Sumo is really about self-service. So you can bring in any data sources, you can install any number of applications that we have in Sumo. You can build your own dashboards and search queries. You can copy anything that we provide to you out of the box. You can sort of change and you can alter that. You can tweak it, and you know, anything you want to do there. So and also you then have access to training, to support, to all of these things. So there really isn't much you need to kind of speak to Sumo about or ask us to do anything like that. You are in full control of the platform. And yes, I got one more question here that really is about Kubernetes support. And the question is, do you support GKE as well as Azure Kubernetes as well as EKS? And yes. So Kubernetes is kind of two things, I would say. The first part is that your application running within the Kubernetes service, or regardless if it's your own cluster or if it's any of these kind of public cloud provider services like GKE and AKS and EKS, the applications and the kind of the workload, so to speak, that's definitely being collected regardless of what service it is. Now, in addition to that, Sumo also collects the kind of control plane information, as we call it. So effectively, you know, if you're running your own Kubernetes cluster, you collect the data from etcd, you collect the data from the API and, you know, the different components within the infrastructure of Kubernetes. And if you run a GKE, or as in Google Kubernetes environment, then we would collect the data that they provide. So that is going to have to be taken from Stackdriver, but effectively we're going to collect the data that Google provides. We're also going to collect the data that AWS provides. This is not strictly the same, so that's why we have sort of different you know, we are effectively collecting all the data that Google, Azure, or AWS kind of provides, but it's not necessarily exactly the same from these different providers. But with that, you get a complete view of course, all your workload and applications, but you also get a view of, like, how is my cluster running? What's the kind of health of my cluster? And is there anything developing in the infrastructure that I need to be aware of? So that's also being taken care of, so to speak. Any other questions? Just feel free to ask. I'm here to help you guys. Okay, if you don't have anything, then I hope you find some sort of valuable information out of this webinar. And you know, I'm here to help. So anytime me or my colleague can help. If you get any questions in addition to this, just send me an email on ulf@sumologic.com. Or reach out to any of my colleagues here in Sumo, and we would be happy to help. I'd also say that there's a Slack channel at sumodojo.slack.com. So you can always go there, and that's a kind of quite healthy community, and any questions you have can also be answered there. And as I said, thanks a lot for taking the time to listen to me today, and hope you start to use Sumo and have some fun with it. Thank you very much.